Who is Mark? The name Mark is mentioned 8 times in the New Testament. What do we learn about Mark from these passages? Acts chapter 12 verse 12 says, when he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John who is called Mark, where there were many people gathered in prayer. Here we learn that Mark's mother hosted the disciples. When Peter was saved from prison, her place was the first place he thought to go. So her house must have had significance for the disciples. This also shows that Mark probably knew the disciples from young. Acts chapter 12 verse 25 says, after Barnabas and Saul completed their relief mission, they returned to Jerusalem, taking with them John, who is called Mark. Here we learn that John was probably his Jewish name and Mark his Latin name. We also learn that Mark went to work with Barnabas and Saul in Antioch. Acts chapter 13 verse 5 says, when they arrived in Salamis, they proclaimed the word of God in the Jewish synagogues. They had John also as their assistant. Here we learn that Mark was with Barnabas and Paul on their journey. Acts chapter 13 verse 13 says, from Paphos, Paul and his companions set sail and arrived at Perga in Pamphylia. But John left them and returned to Jerusalem. In this passage, we learn that Mark left them early in their journey and went back to Jerusalem, his hometown. Later in Acts chapter 15 verses 36 to 40, we read, after some time, Paul said to Barnabas, come, let us make a return visit to see how the brothers are getting on in all the cities where we proclaimed the word of the Lord. Barnabas wanted to take with them also John, who was called Mark, but Paul insisted that they should not take with them someone who had deserted them at Pamphylia and who had not continued with them in their work. So sharp was their disagreement that they separated. Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and departed after being commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. This passage teaches us that Mark's earlier departure was a cause of division between Barnabas and Paul. Then in Colossians chapter 4 verse 10 we read, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, sends you greetings, as does Mark the cousin of Barnabas, concerning whom you have received instructions that if he comes to you, you should receive him. Paul's writings indicate that Mark is the cousin of Barnabas. Perhaps this is the reason why Barnabas wanted to take him a second time, but Paul didn't. Paul also gives clear instructions that people are to receive him. If this is the same Mark, then it might be that some people had heard about the breakup and given Mark a bad name. Here Paul clearly gives him approval. Philemon verses 23 and 24 says, Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, greets you as well as Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke, my co-workers. Here it reports that Mark is with Paul, probably in Rome, so it seems that not only does Paul give him his approval, but they start working together again. 2 Timothy chapter 4 verse 11 says, only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, because he is helpful to me in my ministry. Here is another record of Paul's approval of Mark. Paul sees him as useful for his ministry. Perhaps 2 Timothy is before Philemon, but it is generally accepted as being after. 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 13 says, He who is at Babylon, who is likewise chosen, sends you greetings, and so does Mark, my son. In this passage Peter refers to Mark as my son. This is unlikely to be a physical relationship, but maybe it refers to Mark being converted under Peter, or even just a close relationship. Remember, Peter went to Mark's house when he escaped from prison. It is reported in other ancient literature that Mark was Peter's translator while in Rome, which is probably where 1 Peter is written. There is perhaps one more reference to Mark in the New Testament. If we look at Mark chapter 14 verses 51 and 52, we read about an unnamed young man. Who might this be? Who would know about this incident? Mark as the author knew about it. Why? Maybe it was him who was the young man. If so, this says that he was a young man at the end of Jesus' ministry, when the apostles were a little bit older than him. We don't know if all these references are to the Mark who wrote the Gospel. Perhaps if there were other Marks around they might have given them some other distinguishing name, like the New Testament writes do with the different Judases. But if all these references are to the same Mark, then we have quite a picture of Mark. He was a cousin of Barnabas and spent time amongst the disciples in their early ministry in Jerusalem. He went to Antioch and helped out with the church there under the guidance of Barnabas, who was the senior minister in the church there. When Paul and Barnabas were sent out on their first missionary journey, Mark went with them but after a short period of time went back to his home in Jerusalem. When they went to Jerusalem, Mark joined them again and went back to Antioch with them. When Paul and Barnabas went off again, Barnabas wanted to take Mark with them but Paul refused. So these two great men split up and went their own ways and Barnabas took Mark with him. In time, Paul and Mark seem to have made up and Paul sees Mark as being useful in ministry for him and orders the Colossians to receive him. Mark goes to Rome to be with Paul and perhaps he stays there when Peter comes, being a translator for Peter. If this is an accurate reflection of what happened, how close was Mark to the apostles? He had a first-hand experience of Jesus and the disciples. Where was Mark? And to whom was he writing? Why did he write? We know that Mark was with Peter in Rome. We believe that Peter was killed in Rome under Nero. If Mark was close with Peter during this time, then perhaps Mark wrote the Gospel either just before, or just after Peter was killed. If this is true, then perhaps his primary audience was the Roman Church. There are a few other hints in Mark's Gospel which point towards a Roman audience. Different words are more commonly used in different places to refer to the same thing. Is a Coke a soft drink? Or a cool drink? Or a fizzy drink? Or a soda pop? Or something else? What word is used to describe a Coke or similar drink can give some indication of where the speaker or writer is. In Mark's Gospel there are some Latin terms which were not commonplace in ancient Palestine and only used in the Bible in Mark. In Mark 6 verse 27 King Herod sends an executioner. In Mark 7 verse 4 a pot is referred to. In Mark 15 verses 39, 44, and 45 a centurion is referenced. In Mark 5 verse 26 and chapter 12 verse 42 a penny is noted. These words suggest an area outside of Palestine. What is a gospel? Today if we hear the word gospel, we relate it to the Bible. We relate it to the first 4 books of the New Testament and we relate it to being truth. If someone says something is gospel, it means that it is true. However, when Mark first wrote his gospel, his audience, the people to whom he was writing, had a different understanding of what gospel meant. Gospel literally means good news. Although the word was often used of the announcement of good news about the emperors. For example, this passage from an ancient Roman text talks about the birth of Caesar Augustus. It is a day which we may justly count as equivalent to the beginning of everything. Inasmuch as it has restored the shape of everything that was failing and turning into misfortune and has given a new look to the universe at a time when it would gladly have welcomed destruction if Caesar had not been born. This passage goes on to say that from now on the reckoning of time will begin with his birth. So, the year will start on his birthday. This passage indicates Augustus' birth is very good news. That sounds good, doesn't it? The world was headed for destruction, but Caesar Augustus was born and saved the world. That is certainly good tidings for all. And so, with other emperors when they were crowned Caesar, they too would give good news or gospel to the people so that they would know how lucky they were to have this new Caesar. For Mark, his good news, or his gospel, is different. It is about the Jesus Christ, who is the Son of God. In the proclamation about Caesar, Caesar is called God. However, Mark's gospel is about Jesus, who is the Son of God. Mark's gospel is also considerably longer than Caesar Augustus. Mark's gospel tells the story of Jesus. That is the things that he said and the things that he did. These things reveal his character. They say who Jesus really is. And they reveal the character of God. In addition to this, Mark's gospel builds up to the death and resurrection of Jesus and the power of salvation that this event brings. A whole third of the book is devoted to the last week of Jesus' life. Why did Mark write his gospel? If Mark was Peter's translator in Rome, then it is likely the reason Mark wrote his gospel was to show a picture of Jesus, as verified by Peter and Mark, to the people in Rome. Caesar was a powerful political and military figure and could bring about large change. Jesus was crucified as a political troublemaker in a troublesome part of the Roman Empire. Why would people want to worship this Jesus, rather than Caesar? This is the issue that Mark is addressing. What are some of the key characteristics of Mark's gospel? One key characteristic is its structure. Mark's gospel can be divided into two sections. In the first section, the hiddenness of Jesus as Messiah emphasized. At the start of this section, Jesus tells the demons and unclean spirits not to talk about him as the Messiah. In Mark chapter 1 verses 21 to 26, we read about Jesus telling the unclean spirit to keep quiet. A little bit further along, we find the reason why Jesus commanded them to keep quiet was because they knew him. This is repeated in chapter 3 verses 11 and 12. But Jesus doesn't just tell the demons to keep quiet. He also tells people to hold back. In Mark chapter 1 verses 40 to 44, we find a man is healed. Jesus tells him not to tell anybody about it. Also, in chapter 4 verses 33 and 34, we read how Jesus gave one teaching in public. But for his disciples in private, he gave the full version of the teaching. Again, in chapter 8 verses 11 to 13, we read the Pharisees were looking for a sign. For what kind of sign were they looking? Probably some kind of sign to assure them that Jesus was the Messiah. However, Jesus gave them no sign. This first section culminates in the declaration by Peter that Jesus is the Christ in chapter 8 verse 27 to 30. Although, even at this declaration, Jesus tells the disciples not to tell anybody who is he. From this point on, the gospel is about the fullness of Jesus' person and mission, which climaxes in his death and resurrection on the cross. We read in 8:31 that Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering, and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. It is only after we understand the death and resurrection of Jesus can we fully understand who Jesus is and what he came to do. So, the second section of Mark is about revealing the Messiah, which is completed by his death and resurrection. We see this particularly in chapter 9 verse 9, where Jesus tells his disciples not to speak of his transfiguration until his death and resurrection. Another characteristic of Mark's gospel is its fast pace. It is the shortest gospel in terms of words. There is little in the way of introduction, it gets straight into action. The first verse might be something of a title, but after that it gets straight into the action. John just appears in the wilderness. There are no childhood stories about Jesus or John. There are no prophecies about this is going to happen, and then they happen. Things just happen. John appears baptizing. Then Jesus appears and is baptized. Then what happens? Mark chapter 1 verses 12 says that the Spirit immediately drove Jesus into the wilderness. This verse is the first of many where the word immediately appears. Things happen quickly in this gospel. After one bit of action finishes, the next immediately happens. In the original version, the word immediately appears 8 times in chapter 1 verses 10 to 30, and 40 times in the whole book. Although some versions smooth over the word to make it more readable. And yet, while the gospel is shorter and fast-paced, there are often more details than in other gospels. Sometimes this means a longer version of the story. Like in the story of the feeding of the 5,000. This is also seen in the example of Jesus being tested in the wilderness. Matthew's version of this event is longer. There are some details in Mark not in Matthew, such as the beasts being with Jesus. Another characteristic of Mark's gospel is the disputed ending. Unfortunately, when this book was written, it wasn't saved in the cloud for all time so that we could know exactly what Mark wrote. The gospel was written and passed on to people. It was copied by some and then given to others. Over hundreds of years, the gospel was hand-copied many hundreds of times. Each time someone makes a copy of the old, they are prone to making a mistake. Sometimes these mistakes are small and sometimes they are large. It is easy to miss a whole line of text if the first word of the 2 lines are the same. But many of the mistakes can be seen by collecting a large number of copies and seeing what is there. Sometimes, however, people have to guess between 2 options, and you can see that in Bibles with the footnotes. For example, in Acts chapter 12 verse 25, the NRSV says, "Then after completing their mission, Barnabas and Saul returned to Jerusalem and brought with them John, whose other name was Mark." In the footnotes it says, "Other ancient authorities read from." It makes more sense for it to read them returned from Jerusalem. In Acts chapter 11 verses 29 and 30, the church in Antioch sends Paul and Barnabas down to Jerusalem. Mark lives in Jerusalem and they bring him with them. They return to where? Probably Antioch from Jerusalem. But there is confusion because different copies say different things. In the earliest versions of Mark's Gospel, the end is shorter. If we look at Mark chapter 16 version 9, different Bibles say different things about this being the longer ending. Why don't know why this is so. It may be because on some of the earliest versions the end of the paper or scroll was lost. But some suggest that Mark or someone else added the ending on later. It is likely that Mark is the earliest of the 4 Gospels, and so for me it makes sense that initially there wasn't such a long ending. And that the longer ending was added on later, to make it more like other Gospels. Does it make a big difference? Some people think so. But from the Gospels of Matthew and Luke we have similar information. What are the main themes of Mark's Gospel? The first one is Jesus Christ, the Son of God. The Gospel of Mark starts by saying this is the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ. Earlier we mentioned what was meant by good news. Right at the beginning of this Gospel we have the focus of that good news. It is Jesus is the Christ and the Son of God. Whatever else we might get out of this Gospel, the main focus of this Gospel is Jesus. That Jesus is both the Christ and the Son of God. As we go through the Gospel and read about Jesus' works, his great miracles, and his teaching, it all points towards Jesus as being God's Christ, his Messiah, his anointed one, his servant. In fact, as mentioned earlier, the whole structure of Mark is set around the declaration that Jesus is God's Messiah. But the idea doesn't just stop there. The Jews were waiting for a Messiah, but not the one they got. They were hoping for a messianic figure to come and rescue them from their woes. But the woes from which they were freed were not the ones from which they wanted to be saved. They were saved from their sin. Not from the Romans. They were delivered of the oppression of iniquity. Not from the oppression of Caesar. And the one person capable of really setting them free was the Son of God. A second theme is the hiddenness of Christ. Within the first section of Mark, the first 8 chapters, a major repeated idea is the need to keep the real identity of Jesus hidden. When Jesus casts out demons in Mark chapter 1 verse 34, he forbids the demons to speak because they know who he is. As the story develops, we read about Jesus strictly telling people not to say what has happened, or to reveal who he is. Perhaps one of the reasons for this hiddenness comes from the issue we just mentioned. If Mark is portraying to the people of Rome, why worship Jesus, they will ask, but why was he just crucified as a criminal and not known for he was? Here the answer is, that he wanted to keep quiet who he was. Why would Jesus want to keep that quiet? It was kept secret until he fulfilled what he came to do, which was to die for our sins. A third theme is discipleship. One of the interesting features of Mark's Gospel is the openness about the failures of the disciples. If our earlier deductions about Mark are correct, then this Gospel is Peter's teaching being recorded by Mark and composed through his own experience. Yet the story is very open about the failings of the disciples and particularly Peter. I suspect that one of the reasons for the emphasis on the failings of the disciples is because there is also an emphasis on the cost of discipleship. Before we, as readers of the Gospel, decide whether or not to follow Jesus, we need to be aware of the cost of being one of his disciples. We will fail, like Jesus' disciples, but there is grace for us, just as there was grace for Jesus' disciples. The message of Mark's Gospel is that the cost of discipleship will be paid in rejection and suffering. For Jesus was rejected and suffered. His disciples should also expect to be rejected and suffer as well. Some suggest that the whole second half of this Gospel is focused on Jesus' passion, his suffering. This is particularly relevant for Mark's readers who were probably facing a persecution from the Roman authorities. Another theme is a call to servanthood. Mark's Gospel has 2 passages about the disciples arguing over who is the greatest. First in chapter 9 verse 33, then the request of James and John's mother in chapter 10 verse 35. This is also seen in things like the way the woman in chapter 14 verses 3 to 9 serves Jesus, as well as the failure of the disciples to serve Jesus in his time on need in Gethsemane.